So, hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 2017 iSamples Fall Webinar Series. iSamples, which stands for the Internet of Samples in the Earth Sciences, is an EarthCube NSF-funded research coordination network that seeks to improve the discovery, access, sharing, analysis, and curation of physical samples and the data generated by their study. Today, we have Simon Cox, who will summarize the outcomes of the International Symposium Linking Environmental Data and Samples held at CSIRO in Australia earlier this year. The symposium brought together leading researchers in earth and environmental informatics to advance international and cross-disciplinary adoption of uniform practices for linking data and physical samples. Second, we will have Jens Klump. He will introduce the IGSN Descriptive Metadata Schema and describe updates made in the recently released version 1.1. If you have questions during either presentation, please type them into the chat box. There should also be time for discussion and questions at the end. So Simon, you already have the screen sharing. You may begin when you are ready.
Thank you, Megan. Okay, I've thrown together a summary of what we attempted to do in the symposium with a few reports of outputs and outcomes, but I'm, as you can see from the title slide here, there's a link to the meeting website where anyone who's interested can go and get more detail. As Megan said, this was a symposium that was held in Canberra a couple of months ago. It was part of a series sponsored by CSIRO, which is where Jens and I are both based, though we're on opposite sides of the country, called Cutting Edge Science Symposiums. They run, I don't know, half a dozen of these a year. The first, here I am trying to click forward. Yeah, there we go. First thing I want to do is acknowledge the where the financial support for financial and logistical support for the meeting came from. Underwritten by CSIRO, a number of other Australian government departments kicked in. The middle column of logos there is a number of research infrastructure initiatives based in Australia, AusScope, which is in the solid earth sciences, TURN, which is ecosystems, ALA, Atlas of Living Australia, which is biodiversity, and NCI, the National Computational Infrastructure, which is high performance computing and large storage. And we also had a number of US organizations kick in, primarily through support for travel expenses relating to some of the US-based participants, and the ESIP, the Earth Science Information Partnership, gave a lot of assistance with designing and managing and running the symposium. So having said that, the goals, this actually has been taken straight from the website, but with the final point also a bit of emphasis. Megan also already more or less sort of summarized this. The middle point there also, I'll just bring out, the focus was intended to be on linking data with a particular focus on issues around the integration of physical samples with data sets based on these. The coordination network, the iSamples coordination network, I guess, is something which, and the NSF nod before on the previous slide, the sponsors thing, was because there was some funding through the iSamples RCN, which in fact was supported some of the participants. We don't have anything quite like that in Australia. On the other hand, we do have these more sort of disciplinary or domain-based infrastructure projects, the ones that I mentioned before, but the coordination between these has been relatively limited to date, and so part of the goal of the symposium was to bring together those more domain-based organisations in Australia with some international perspectives. And the Cutting Edge Science Symposia through CSIRO are also intended to support the engagement of early career scientists with international international specialists. So you know, putting it, you know, a little bit more briefly, the desired outcomes to network, to make new connections, find collaborators, a bit around education with some descriptions of best practices, stories of success and failure, and I'll get onto this in a moment. Particularly this cross-domain alignment between geo, bio, and environmental, and looking at some short-term alignment opportunities and coordination. So the participation, we kept it to what we hoped would be a manageable number to allow for lots of interaction. So this wasn't a big conference, it was a medium-sized meeting with about 75 registrants. There was typically about 60 people in plenary, you know, some people had other business they were dealing with, particularly those people who were based in Canberra, so didn't attend all the time. But we managed to attract around 20 travellers from internationally, around 20 early career scientists, again around 20 from higher ed institutions, which by your standards, it was probably on the low side. A lot of government agencies, and coming out of being based in CSIRO, there was a significant representation from a variety of different business units across CSIRO. Again, I'll emphasize that the disciplinary or domain representation came primarily from ocean sciences, geochemistry, ecosystems, biodiversity, hydrology, and a number of information engineers. The program, we started with a field trip. This is a bit of a tradition, particularly in the earth sciences, to build in a field trip, partly for the content, but partly for the socialization of the participants in the meeting. Field trip talking about samples actually took us to Geoscience Australia for the morning, and that's a picture of people looking on at these, which is the sample store in the one wing at Geoscience Australia, which is kind of more or less equivalent to USGS, but unlike USGS, it really is centralized at one facility in Canberra, which then interact with state-based geological surveys. But this is just one of the corridors in big compactus arrangement in the rock store, and a remarkably large fraction of those boxes have got Leslie Wyborn's name on the side of them, reflecting her previous identity as a field geologist in igneous petrology. We also went to the Botanic Garden, and so there's picture of people being talked at there, and there's an example of a bit of Australian flora in the Botanic Garden, which wasn't actually was in the Botanic Garden, but the field trip also took in a couple of collections, the National Herbarium and the insect collection. The insect collection, kind of interesting the way they handle metadata there, which is the labels on the sample mounts printed in 4-point type, which is quite challenging. So we started with a field trip. There were some keynotes, formal sessions, as you would expect, comprised of keynotes and short talks. The keynotes, Tim Rawling from Ozscope, Donald Hoburn from GBIF, Peter Fox from ESIP and RPI, Kirsten, who I think probably you all know, on Open Science, Open Samples, Marcus Stocker from Marum, Doug Phils from Ocean Leadership, and Wim Hugo from the South African Ecosystems or Observation Network, SEON. So a reasonable distribution of representations from around the world. So there was pitches from the early career researchers and also posters. A significant amount of the time of the symposium, in fact, the whole of every afternoon, more or less, of the 3 days was an unconference. Those were breakouts, 2 or 3 breakouts, 2 or 3 sessions, the topics of which were not fixed in advance, but were emerged from the focuses kicked off by the keynotes in the mornings. There was also an anti-conference, which was the confessional, hosted by Father Paul, which was a place which, in contrast to your typical conference where people stand on their hind legs and boast about the great things they've done and how everything went right, provided an opportunity for a few people to confess about the things that did not necessarily go smoothly. Unfortunately, we don't always have the opportunity to reflect on the things that went wrong and take all the learnings from those, and that was the intention here. It was done behind a screen, so strict anonymity was preserved, and appeared to be much appreciated. We also finished off the meeting with an upgoer challenge in the bar. This picked up on a session which I think has run at least 1, maybe 2 years at AGU now, where the requirement is that you present make a presentation describing a technical topic using only the 10-100 words, most used words in English. So we had a nice one here from Brent McInnes, who's an Australian geochemist, who was describing where to find diamonds, which are small, pretty rocks, which are only found in very hot, weird rocks that cut their way up to the land along faults from very, very deep under the ground. Very limited vocabulary here in the words that were used, although not in the pictures, obviously. Anyway, the outcomes, the most concrete outcomes. Oh, that's interesting. Microsoft PowerPoint has just stopped working. I wonder how we'll go from here. We'll see. Kaboom. I will attempt to restart it. Ah, it's restarting itself. Let's see. Now I need to swap the displays. Sorry about that, guys. Keep our fingers crossed here. I've also lost my, there we go. Okay, I think we're back in control now. So the outcomes, concrete outcomes, there's an abstracts volume. The next point, we developed a definition of sample to apply a cross-disciplinary definition. I'll discuss that, I think, on the next slide. We're in the process of developing a business case and a plan for how to run on a more ongoing basis an ESIP down under, ESIP Australia, although finding the right home and the right sponsor is interesting. There is a session at the upcoming AGU 4 meeting with approximately the same title on linking data and samples. As a consequence of the people being in the same place, there were a couple of side meetings held on the immediately following the symposium, either on the last day or actually spilling over into the next week in terms of the ELFI initiative, which is an open geospatial consortium project on with linking features and hydrology and geology. So, and also the International Geochemistry Network attempted to have a kickoff meeting. So, in terms of what I'd like to put on the table for this meeting, a provisional cross-domain definition of sample, which started in one of the unconference breakout meetings and then was refined a little over the next 2 or 3 weeks. So here's some words. A sample is a thing or subset, real or virtual, which is intended to be representative of a larger thing or set. These words are chosen quite carefully in order to accommodate the expectations of the definition of samples, both in the social sciences, the life sciences, the earth sciences, and the idea hopefully is that this is something that allows us to use the word sample in a way that we can share and all understand. So samples are created or selected for the purpose of making observations or measurements. The most important property of a sample is its relationship to the larger thing. If that relationship may not necessarily be known at the time of sampling, but the intention of a sample is to have something which allows you to assign numbers or a classification to some bigger thing. So a material sample or specimen is typically selected to allow ex situ observations. That's observations in a lab using a machine that goes ping or something, or on a section, or breaking it into pieces so that you can make observations on bits and pieces of it. It has been commented by the life scientists that sometimes a specimen is collected because it's interesting and we don't yet know if it is representative of anything. But under this provisional definition of sample, the intention is that when we are sampling, we are characterizing something bigger, be it a bigger formation or a bigger organism or a bigger population. So on that last one, a statistical sample or a subset is a specified number of individuals from a population where the selection of those individuals is done in some way so that as far as we can make it, we get representation. Spatiotemporal sample may have the same dimension but a smaller extent than the thing which it represents, lower topological dimension. That means, for example, a cross-section through a three-dimensional object, or a transect across a landscape. Samples are often related to other samples, either through subsampling or as members of a sequence of siblings. I had quite strong opinions and had got quite a lot of this formulation ahead of time, because a lot of the sort of conceptual underpinning for these definitions was developed actually in some work I did through OGC 10 years ago on a standard which subsequently became an ISO standard and has now been transitioned also into W3C on observations and measurements. And this is the link, and I'll make these slides available afterwards, to the specific place on the website where where this material is captured. So in fact, the idea of sampling did come up in one of the Upgoer Challenge presentations, the one that I did. In short words, you can take a small piece of a thing or stuff in the world using a piece-taking thing, which may take many forms, like these kinds of things. And the recent work in W3C has formalized the relationships of samples and acts of sampling and sampling devices or samplers as part of an ontology, the revision of the semantic sensor network ontology, about to become a W3C recommendation. Other highlights, I've got there was compiled at the end some of the humorous highlights coming out of the sessions in the meeting. I'll just zip through those. Some of the concepts that we're working with here, the links between systems and samples and data sets, require that you work with the cows, the coalition of the willing. Sometimes people get a bit carried away with what their expectations of what can be done. These were referred to as brain farts. Need to be not too worried about moving forward and pushing ideas out so that the tires can be kicked, so that we can test prototypes. Be willing to send your ugly duckling out into the world. Data composting was an interesting concept, although you have to make sure to get the compost mix right, to get the balance of data and analysis sorted out. There was some mention of traits. Size of hands was discussed. There was an analogy used, which is the water hole. This is something that Jens talks about a bit, how to attract the right organisms to the place, but you need to think about crocodiles and lions. There's also taming the masses. We want to encourage the masses, but we have to be a little bit careful about how we apply our governance spray. Incentives are important, both real and sometimes slightly imaginary. ESIP money was mentioned. And we have to recognize that sometimes the samples are destroyed in order to do the analysis. Anyway, I'll close there. I think I've used up my 20 minutes of presentation time so that we can have some discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. That was great. We only have a few people on the call right now, but you are welcome to unmute yourself and ask questions if you have them, or type them into the chat box. Looks like there are actually still people joining us. Simon, there is one question that did come in. We were wondering if you could expand upon the sort of confessional session that you said was a symposium. If you could give us any examples of what kinds of things came up.
Gosh, I'm trying to remember. We had 4 confessions, and they were, I think it was probably largely around over-ambition, trying to run before we can walk. Jens, perhaps you can help me here if you can recall the exact details. I think Leslie was in the confession, and Squid was anonymized as Squid, even though that's the name he always goes by.
I don't remember the details of the confession. I focused more on the things we learned from the confession, and the 2 main patterns that we identified was, one was what we called the Life of Brian era, where everything is so special, right, you cannot compare it with anything else. And the other one were what I would now call the white elephants. They are too big to fail. It's too embarrassing to admit that you've invested millions of dollars into something that is actually not very useful.
Yeah. But it's it was an experiment running the confessional. It wasn't something that any of us, I don't think, had seen before, or at least done quite so nakedly. We had an excellent facilitator for that, who had the right balance of sort of humor and insight. So it's not something to be it was almost set up. It was a risky thing to do, but the consensus in the room that it was a useful thing to do. Now, obviously, we did a bit of theatre around it and made it, reasonably humorous. And even though it was anonymized, everyone knew exactly who was talking at each point. But the ability to stand up and say, actually, this wasn't such a good idea, or this went wrong for these reasons. And I think Jens has the important thing is the lessons that you take, or the messages that you take away from it. And the messages there are that, sometimes it is difficult to walk away from something which you've put significant investment in. And we need to think about how we can reduce the risk or reduce the sanction. Permit people to be ambitious, but also allow them to fail, but fail more gracefully, in order to take the learnings away, rather than just focus on hiding embarrassment. And we're all individuals. Issue is a huge one. Every discipline thinks that it is special, it's got these special things, and on the one hand, they're right, every discipline is different, but there are significant learnings that can be carried from one to another, and we need to In some cases, those learnings are the things not to do, or the things which, oh, that was a good idea, but if it was tweaked just this little bit, then we could go further. I think probably Jens, with his upcoming presentation on IGSN, will be able to reflect on the choices that were made for IGSN that were great ones, and the ones which, in retrospect, there may have been a better option, which might even have been known at the time, although in some cases the wisdom comes with hindsight, of course.
Thank you very much, Simon. I think we'll move on to Jens' presentation now, but if anybody else has questions, again, oh, wait, we have one more question. Let's get this one in there. So Gary has asked, what would be a good pathway of action items that you'd recommend for those interested in joining this herd? What do you recommend as an immediate step for becoming a cow?
Right, for becoming a cow. Wow. It seems to me that the iSamples Research Coordination Network is clearly a cow. That's exactly, I mean, at least that's the intention of the Research Coordination Network. So you're in the right place to be a cow. I suppose the thing which, you know, the sort of philosophy which underpinned the whole conception of the symposium was that we are attempting to build infrastructures collaboratively and cooperatively, which means giving up a bit of control and delegating some things which you may feel there's some risk associated with not retaining control of those things. So an area which I've done a lot of work on over the last 5 to 10 years has been in vocabularies and vocabulary services, and we've stood up a number of prototype vocabulary services, but recently there's been momentum falling in Australia behind a different one hosted by an external organization, where, you know, there are some technical challenges and some technical deficiencies, in fact, in what they are doing, but the situation on the ground, this is the Australian National Data Service with their vocabulary services, the situation on the ground is that there has been a general move by a number of institutions, including CSIRO and Geoscience Australia, to adopt a less than perfect solution, but on the assumption, because this supports the community working coherently, and my own group and team are now falling in behind that for some of our work, and that's you swallow your pride sometimes in order to go with the greater good and get scalability, and accept the fact that in a network loosely coupled environment that the community benefit sometimes has to take precedence over some local reputational or idea of perfection.
Thank you, Simon. And from the iSamples perspective, I just wanted to say that we've been approved for another year of no-cost extension, and if there are ways that we can help facilitate or in any way, let us know. We had only this webinar planned so far, but we are ready and willing to continue this discussion. Okay, so Jens, I will now pass you the presenter.
So I hope you can see my screen now.
Can you flip the display again?
Oh, do you have to?
Yeah, same problem.
Perfect.
Oh. When we did the test run, I had it the other way around. Okay, whatever. Okay, so thank you for still being around for what I consider a rather dry topic, descriptive metadata. At the start, I also want to acknowledge all the work that Anusuriya Devaraju has done. So I put her on this slide as a co-author, although she actually did the bulk of the work in coordinating all the issues, while I just kept to the grand picture. So what is this whole thing about? To give you a brief introduction, so the IGSN Descriptive Metadata Schema is the product of many precursor works, and this is, for instance, the IGSN iSamples workshop held in September 2015 in Los Angeles, the work we did here in Perth on the CSIRO rock store. Then we had 2 grants from the Research Data Services in the collaboration of CSIRO, Geoscience Australia, and Curtin University to build things around IGSN and the national portal. There's ODM2 implemented in CSAR and many other precursor works that fed into our thinking of how we want to describe things. And one of the major outcomes of the workshop in Los Angeles was to agree that this description schema should be designed to be the birth certificate of the sample, and it should aid discovery of existing samples, but alongside this kind of what I call vanilla flavor metadata, communities of practice can also define additional schemas that are tailored for their use cases and are more expressive in those specific use cases. So why did we do this? To give you an overview of how the system works, so this is modeled on DataCite, but it has some significant deviations from that pattern. And to take you through the workflow for sample registration, the first step is that a client registers a sample with a so-called agent, and in this passes 2 packets of metadata, what we call administrative or registration metadata and the description metadata. And then the agent registers the sample with IGSN, and for that the agent uses only the administrative or registration metadata, which is a small packet. I will explain that in a little bit more detail just now. Then the agent offers the catalog of all its holdings through a so-called OAI-PMH interface. OAI-PMH is the Open Archivals Initiative protocol for metadata harvesting. And through this protocol offers descriptive metadata. And to enable this process, we designed this general description metadata schema, but the protocol allows to serve other metadata schemas as well. These can then be harvested into portals. And this separation of administrative and descriptive metadata is one of the learnings we took from the way DataCite was set up. I was involved in the precursor project that led to the foundation of DataCite, so I had quite some insight into the decisions we made back then. And what I thought was that if you only offer one metadata schema, that is kind of limiting, because if you want to offer metadata as a common service, you either have to come to a least common denominator, which might be fairly poor, or you have to make it all encompassing with lots of optional elements and quite complicated. And people don't like that because they see that as too complicated, and with too many empty fields, it also is just as useless or useful depending on what you want to do. And allowing parallel descriptive metadata schemas to be served as well, we allow communities of practice to define their metadata as an extension of the core metadata data set or as something completely different. And as an example, to show how this works, and this is how far our funds carried us in this project, we set up a demo portal to demonstrate this principle. The Australian IGSN portal demo harvests metadata catalogues from CSIRO, Geoscience Australia, and Curtin University. Now, Curtin University started out registering their samples through CSIR, so we actually harvest CSIR, and then display these aggregated catalogues through our website. This implementation was funded by the Australian Research Data Services program, and so I included the logos of the organizations and RDS at the bottom of the slide. You can go to http and so on igsn.org.au to have a look at what it looks like. So the portal still has its deficiencies. It's a demo. In the next round, we will work on it to refine it. So just briefly mentioning what is this administrative or registration metadata. It has 4 very simple elements: the sample number, the registrant, the related identifier, and a log element. The URL of the landing page is not part of this metadata, but it's part of the web service call used to register the sample. So the sample number is the IGSN. The registrant is the name of the organization registering the sample and its identifier. The related identifier is the really interesting element, I think, because it points to other related objects, which could be other IGSNs, it could be DOIs, it could be ORCIDs or whatever, and it describes the nature of this relation. And then the log element is kind of a logbook entry describing the event, when it happened, and allowing you to comment on anything else you might want to add for this administrative process. Now, when it comes to the registration metadata, it's a different thing. And to illustrate what I mean, how I see descriptive metadata, I want to refer to this unlabeled tin and then ask, what would you like to know about this tin? So obviously, what is the content? But maybe you would also be interested in what is the sell-by date? Is it still something that I can eat, if at all? Does it contain nuts? Is the inside coating BPA free? How much does it cost? When I'm at the cashier paying, I don't maybe care about whether it contains nuts, but I do want to know how much it costs. And as the vendor, I might be interested in how many of those are still on the shelf. What does the supply chain look like, etc. And there's so many more questions you can ask. This is all metadata about reuse, discovery maybe, but do I need to know everything at every point? And so it's important to keep in mind that metadata always serve a purpose. And when you design a metadata schema, you have to keep that purpose in mind. Otherwise, you run into horrible scope creep and resulting in a description that might not be very useful. So what does the description actually look like? It has 4 blocks of elements, starting with the sample identification, then sample curation information about the sampling activity, and links to related resources. And all these elements refer to the IGSN administration process, to the ODM2 model developed together with Grazi, observations, measurements, and data site. So sample identification is the IGSN itself, the so-called field name, some type and classification. Sample curation tells you about who collected it, who curates it, where is it home. Then there's some sampling activity about the location, time, sampling feature, and the collection method, not the collector. Sorry about that. And some related resources information about what does it relate to and how does it relate to it, and I'll give you a bit more detail now. So in the sample identification, we have the identifier, which is a unique string that identifies the resource. Then we have a field called name, and I will come back to this field. The text string is for people to understand what is identified, which could include the local or field name. It's not globally unique, but typically unique within a set of specimens. There might be other formal identifier systems used for this resource in addition to the IGSN. There's relations to other identifiers and some descriptive text. Something you would want to add to it. But since the purpose of this schema is to be the birth certificate, this is typically text that won't change too much over the life cycle of the sample. In the curation element section, we look at elements like the registrant, who was the agent that actually registered this resource, which can be compared to the publisher in Dublin Core or DataCite. Who's the collector? And the collector can have different roles in this. And who's the contributor? That is agents that contribute to the resource, which might be the funder, technician, or the principal investigator who came up with the idea to do this. Then we have some things about the sampling activity, which is the location, the description of what does this sample look like. Is it a polished section, piece of core, rock pulp, a solution, dredge hall, whatever. It can also be a collection, a so-called lot, or others. So then in the next element, we look at the materials, which is not the shape it's presented in, but the material, water, granite, tissue, or also those collective samples like a dredge hall, a drill core, that may have multiple materials included. This feeds into the collection methods, which is a broad classification of instrument and technique used to create or extract this resource, and the collection time when the sample was collected, which may be an instant or an interval. And yeah, then in the related resources, we look at the sample access. This indicates whether this resource is available for reuse beyond the original contributor. Because one of the motivations of the IGSN is to enable reuse of samples. This is not always the case. Sometimes samples cannot be given away for whatever reasons, but this should be known. And there might be more rich metadata available at some other location, and this can be given in the supplemental metadata element. In the elements that describe things in more detail, we make use of controlled vocabularies. So we didn't then reinvent wheels here, but wherever possible, reused vocabularies that already existed, which is for about half of the lists. So in access, that's fairly simple. It is or not, or restricted. That's something we came up with ourselves. The nature of the collection, describing an aggregate of samples as well. But then the sampling feature goes back to the observation and measurement standard, where we source this vocabulary from Quasi. The material type, whether it's soil, rock, vegetation, etc., is ODM2, which also comes from Quasi. So similar with the methods. Spatial reference ID, on the other hand, we source from EPSG on OGC and so on. So I won't go through all the details here, just to show you this is something where we try to draw on resources that already exist instead of inventing something ourselves. This leads me to some open issues and improvements that can still be made. So recently I had a discussion with Robert Huber from Marum at the University of Bremen in Germany about field names and accession numbers. And he's much closer to the museums and biodiversity world than I am. And he pointed out the importance of the accession numbers in museum collections. And just having a name element, which is equivalent to the Dublin Core title, the field names and accession numbers don't really fit into this that well. So this is something we need to discuss for the next iteration of the sample. And maybe you notice that the related identifier elements pops up both in the registration metadata and in the description metadata. But where should it actually be? Should it be in the registration, description, or in both? If we put it into the registration, which is its current place, we have a centralized structure, which is part of the registration process. We can serve this easily to other services. If we put it into the description, we would enrich the description metadata, but it would be decentralized, but could be harvested into other services. If we have this element in both sides of the system, in the registration process and in the catalogs, this might lead to the entries diverging as being out of sync. So that's a discussion we need to have, how we want to treat this in the next version of the metadata schema. And then I showed you all those vocabularies, which is fine to have them in centralized places, but we still need to work out how do we actually work with these, which ones not only, but also if we need changes to be made, additions to the vocabularies, how are those vocabularies governed? That I think is still pretty early works. Simon might be able to comment on this, but I don't think that this is something that works really well yet. So in the next steps, we start development of the description data schema version 2 now. We will continue to work with DataCite, with the biological research community and the museum community to enhance the interoperability of our identifier systems. And I would also like to see the development of discipline or application-specific profiles that can be served alongside the very general description schema. So in summary, this work was all based on prior works to develop this description schema. It's only one of many ways to describe samples, and it has been standardized to enhance the discoverability of samples. That's the main thing. It doesn't really serve reuse very well, or in some cases, not really. And the experience we gain in working with this and the changing requirements as the system evolves will make future changes of the schema necessary. So this is ongoing work. For additional technical information, I refer you to our documentation on GitHub. And if you want to have a look at the portal again, it's at igsn.org.au. So that's all from my side. Thank you for staying up that late on the other side of the Pacific.
Thank you, Jens. There has been some lively discussion in the chat box between Simon and Gary in particular. I wonder if you all might want to speak in person.
Let me have a look at the discussion. I only glanced at from the corner of my eye. Simon, you've been discussing. Why don't you start?
Sorry, I need to unmute myself. Yeah. Primarily, I was just giving some links to some supporting resources, many of which Jens has referred to at least obliquely, but some of which are a little bit more recent. I also mentioned it in my presentation around the work that's coming out of W3C, sort of like right now. So there's a couple of links there, as well as the more historical work to the observations and measurements. But then Gary and I have been discussing accession numbers. I mentioned in the previous presentation the importance of, or the very almost ubiquitous, very common situation that samples come in groups. The relationships between the groups of samples can be many and varied. It sounds like the accession number is related to samples ending up in collections in lots or in groups. That actually hadn't been one of the groupings that I had at the front of my mind, but I can see very relevant. So it is certainly, I guess, the third of the little comments that I made, the second of the links about sample relations. That's something that I managed to get put into the semantic sensor network ontology document. In fact, I wrote this little clause here, and basically the idea there is there are so many different kinds of relationships between samples, part, whole, one of a lot, adjacency geometrically, adjacency in time, subsets and supersets and these things that we can't possibly enumerate all these relationships, and so you need a scalable way nevertheless of capturing them quite rigorously, and that little the little pattern in that document that we've proposed for sample relations is intended to catch this. In the background is the notion of a sample collection, which is something which actually was in O&M, didn't make its way into the SSN yet, but I've got I'm intending to move on to do a bit of work on that. So my question in the chat had been whether accession number was just an also known as identifier, when we more or less know how to handle those, but if it's part of a one member of a collection thing, then it needs to be teased out a little bit in that theory. I'm not sure about in IGSN.
My comments about accession numbers. This is Gary Motes here. As a paleontologist and a geoscientist that's trying to straddle both the biosciences communities and earth sciences communities, sort of best practices for describing collections data. Accession numbers are generally used as a one-to-many relationship where it describes sort of the legal registration of those samples into the formal repository at the physical level, whereas an IGSN or as a GWID, as far as I understand, would be that active registration with the administrative data to an international organization like CSIRO, for example. But a collection is sort of a hierarchical relationship to those samples, but you can even have an even higher aggregation of multiple collections that are all related to generally by the agent that collects those samples. And so an accession number could be assigned to the sum total of the samples that were collected by an individual researcher over the course of their career upon their retirement, or if they're a little bit more organized and get their things together to formally accession and reposit those physical samples as they go, to document them and to legally grant ownership and deed the physical samples to the repository at the point of publication or nearly thereafter. So those are generally the relationships between accessions, because they can be quite diverse. And it really is a legal framework for the physical ownership of the specimens, and can be hierarchical.
Okay, that's really interesting, Gary. That legal custodial aspect to it. I hadn't quite caught that before. It's one of the aspects of context.
All right, well, we're creeping up on the top of the hour. So I just wanted to say thank you to Simon and to Jens, and for the rest of you for your participation tonight. If you're interested in engaging further with the iSamples RCN or with a specific working group within the iSamples RCN, you can join our mailing lists and follow us on our website. These webinars will be archived on the iSamples YouTube channel and linked on the iSamples website for future viewing, and we hope to see you all at a future webinar.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you very much, Megan.
All right, thank you.
Pleasure.